Then came a moment even more surprising. Pastor John rolled up his sleeves and carried a heavy bucket of water to the floor near the entrance. He took a rag, knelt down, and began scrubbing the tiles by hand. The church had a cleaner, but he knew the man was struggling with his health and hadn't been able to do as much lately. John didn't want to burden him. So he cleaned quietly, sweat forming on his forehead, his knees aching against the hard floor. Still, he scrubbed with patience and care, treating the task not as a chore, but as an offering. Every movement spoke of humility. Every act was one most people would never notice. And yet, through the lens of the camera, all of it was captured: the prayers, the giving, the singing, the cleaning. Hours passed. The sun had long set, and the church was now bathed in the soft glow of candles and moonlight streaming through the windows. Pastor John finally sat down on one of the pews, exhausted. He clasped his hands together and prayed once more. "Thank you, Lord, for giving me the chance to serve. Even when no one sees, you see. And that is enough for me." He rose, blew out the candles, and prepared to leave. He looked back at the church one last time before turning off the lights. To him, it was just another evening spent in quiet service. Acts too small for anyone to care about. But the truth was different. The camera had been watching the entire time, silently recording a side of him that no one in the community had ever witnessed. Not the preacher at the pulpit, not the man giving Sunday sermons, but the humble servant who prayed, cleaned, gave, and loved in silence. What Pastor John didn't realize that night was that those ordinary actions were about to become extraordinary. When others saw the footage later, they wouldn't just see a pastor in a church. They would see the very heart of a man revealed, and the video would change how people thought about him forever. The following week started like any other. Pastor John went about his routine, preparing sermons, visiting the sick, and checking in on families in need. He had completely forgotten about the security camera tucked high in the corner of the church. To him, that evening of sweeping floors, fixing books, lighting candles, and slipping money into envelopes had been nothing more than his quiet way of serving God. He had no idea those private hours were about to change his life. The church caretaker, who had recently been asked to test the camera, reviewed the footage to make sure everything was working properly. What he saw left him speechless. He had expected empty hallways and perhaps a few shadows from passing cars outside. But instead, he witnessed the pastor moving through the church like a gentle guardian. He saw him sweep, clean, repair, and pray with such devotion it felt almost unreal. Most of all, he saw the pastor quietly slipping money into envelopes. Money he knew came from his own small salary. The caretaker sat back in his chair, tears filling his eyes. "People need to see this," he whispered. At first, he shared the video with a few close members of the congregation. Their reactions were immediate: shock, admiration, and tears. Many had always respected Pastor John, but seeing him in these unguarded moments was something else entirely. It revealed a side of him that even his closest friends had never truly understood. Word spread quickly, and soon the video was shared beyond the walls of the church. The footage began circulating online. What had started as a simple camera test became a viral sensation. Strangers from all over the world watched in awe as they saw a man, alone in his church, quietly serving when no one else was there. The comments poured in. "This is what true faith looks like. Real character is what you do when you think no one is watching. I don't even go to church." But this touched my heart. People who had lost hope in humanity found themselves moved by the pastor's humble acts. Parents shared the video with their children, teaching them about kindness and integrity. Other pastors admitted the clip had inspired them to live more simply and give more freely. Back in the small town, the community gathered around Pastor John, many in tears as they thanked him. Some confessed they hadn't realized how much he gave, not just publicly, but privately too. Others admitted the video had changed how they viewed their own lives. If he could give so much in silence, what was stopping them from doing the same? When Pastor John first saw the video, he was embarrassed. He never intended for his private actions to be broadcast. He shook his head, saying softly, "I didn't do any of this to be noticed." But the people around him reminded him that sometimes the world needs examples like his. Reminders that kindness, humility, and love still exist. The impact went beyond words. Donations to the church increased, not because people felt pressured, but because they were inspired. Families who had once drifted away from faith returned, saying they wanted to be part of a community that lived with such honesty. Strangers wrote letters to Pastor John, thanking him for showing them what true service looked like. One evening, as the sun set and the church filled with soft, golden light, Pastor John stood quietly by the altar. He thought about the camera, about how his private actions had become public, and about the unexpected way his story had touched so many. He prayed again, but this time his words were different. "Lord, if my simple work has reached hearts, let it not be about me. Let it be about you. Let it be about love." From then on, the church was no longer just a building in a small town. It became a symbol of humility and faith, all because one camera captured the truth of a man's heart. Pastor John never sought fame or attention, but he became an inspiration far beyond what he could have imagined. And so, the story spread, not as a tale of a pastor caught on camera, but as a timeless reminder that the greatest acts of goodness are often the ones done in secret. True character, after all, shines brightest when we believe no one is watching. Pastor John had lived in the same small town his entire life. Everyone in the community knew him as a kind and gentle soul. He wasn't just a preacher who stood at the pulpit on Sundays. He was someone who lived his faith every single day. Whether it was visiting the sick, comforting grieving families, or helping children with their homework after school, Pastor John gave himself fully to the people around him. To most people, he seemed like a man who never tired, who never stopped serving. But what they didn't know was how much he quietly did when no one else was around. It was an ordinary afternoon, and the church was empty. The sunlight filtered through the tall stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the wooden floor. Pastor John walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing softly in the quiet space. He looked around, as he always did, making sure everything was in order. To him, the church wasn't just a building where people came to pray. It was a home for anyone searching for peace. He treated every corner of it with care, as if it were alive. On that particular day, Pastor John had no idea a small security camera, recently installed near the back of the hall, was recording him. It had been placed there after some local break-ins, meant to keep the church safe at night. He didn't think about it. In fact, he forgot it even existed. To him, this was just another quiet afternoon of tending to the place he loved. He picked up a broom and began sweeping the aisles, moving carefully between the pews. Most pastors would leave such tasks for others, but John never saw himself as above anyone. To him, cleaning was just another form of service. As he swept, he hummed a soft hymn under his breath, the sound blending with the stillness of the empty room. Dust rose and danced in the beams of sunlight, almost as if the air itself was listening to his song. After sweeping, he noticed a few hymn books on the pews with torn pages. He carefully gathered them and carried them to his small office. There, he took out some tape and glue from a drawer and began repairing them one by one. Each book had been held by countless hands, sung from by families, children, and elderly worshipers. To others, they might have looked like old worn books, but to John, they were treasures. He smiled softly as he taped the pages back, whispering, "You still have songs to sing." Hours passed, and the quiet tasks continued. He lit candles at the altar and knelt down to pray. His prayers were not for himself, but for others. He spoke each name slowly, carefully, as if every word carried weight. For Mrs. Thompson's health. For little Jacob's struggles in school. For the Smith family to find peace after their loss. The list went on and on. He prayed for his town, for his congregation, for people he barely even knew but had heard were in pain. Alone in the church, with no one listening but God, he poured his heart out in prayer. When he stood again, his back ached, but he didn't mind. On his way out of the office, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a few folded bills. He slipped them into blank donation envelopes, writing no names, leaving no clues. Later, he would quietly place them in the donation box, knowing they would end up in the hands of struggling families. It was something he did often, but never spoke about. He didn't want recognition. He just wanted to help. Outside, the world carried on. Cars drove by. Children played in the park across the street. Shopkeepers closed their stores for the evening. But inside the church, Pastor John moved through his quiet routine, completely unaware that every small act was being captured by the lens of the camera. He stopped for a moment and looked around the empty hall. A faint smile appeared on his face as he whispered to himself, "Even when no one is here, this place feels alive." He walked slowly toward the altar, running his fingers gently across the polished wood as if it were an old friend. To him, these silent moments were just as sacred as the crowded Sunday services. As the sun began to set, the light in the church shifted to a golden glow. Pastor John gathered his things, ready to head home, tired but content. He didn't know that the hours he had just spent sweeping floors, repairing books, praying for others, and giving quietly from his own pocket would soon be seen by many. To him, it was just another ordinary day. But to the camera that had been silently watching, it was proof of a man's true character when he thought no one else was looking. And so, Pastor John locked the doors behind him, walking into the cool evening air, completely unaware that his private actions would soon become a story that touched thousands of hearts. Asterisk. The church stood still that evening, the kind of silence that feels almost holy. Outside, the streets were noisy with cars and laughter. But inside, only the sound of Pastor John's slow footsteps echoed across the wooden floor. He thought he was alone, just finishing another quiet day of service. What he didn't know was that every action, every small gesture, was being recorded by the camera high on the wall as he walked toward the altar. He noticed a few scraps of paper left behind in the pews, crumpled notes, children's scribbles, and one folded piece of paper tucked between the hymn books. He picked it up, unfolded it, and realized it was a prayer request someone had left. In shaky handwriting, a child had written, "Please help my mom find work so we can buy food." Pastor John's heart tightened. He held the paper gently, whispering, "Lord, hear this child's prayer." He slipped the note into his pocket. Determined to help, instead of leaving, he began moving through the rows of seats, stopping at different places to lay his hand gently on the wood. He whispered prayers over each one. "Bless the man who sits here each week. Give peace to the family who always sits in the back row. Bring strength to the young woman who cries here silently." No one was there to hear him. No applause, no recognition, but he prayed as if the room were full. Later, he went into his office, opened his drawer, and pulled out a small box. Inside were envelopes, some already sealed with bills tucked inside. He had been quietly saving a portion of his own modest salary to help the people in his town. That night, he added more money, labeling the envelopes with words like "for groceries" and "for medicine." He didn't sign his name. He never did. These envelopes would later find their way into the hands of struggling families, and they would never know who helped them. That was exactly how Pastor John wanted it when he returned to the sanctuary. He noticed the candles on the altar had burned low. He replaced them with fresh ones, carefully lighting each wick. As the warm glow filled the room again, he bowed his head and sang softly, his voice trembling but full of emotion. It wasn't a performance. It was a prayer in the form of song. The empty church absorbed his words, the flickering candlelight making it feel as if heaven itself was listening.